Good evening, everyone. I'm Jodi Hauptman, Senior Curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this virtual view on the occasion of our current exhibition, Cézanne Drawing. I want to begin by thanking all of the many supporters of this exhibition project and the accompanying publication, and to acknowledge the exceptional generosity of the many lenders who have shared their wonderful works with us and our public. Many of you may already know Paul Cézanne for his paintings. In this exhibition, our ambition is to shift that emphasis and not only call attention to his fascinating drawing practice, but to make the case that his most radical, most experimental work happens on paper in his drawings. Cézanne drew almost every day in sketchbooks and on single sheets. He used standard materials, pencil, watercolor, paper, and with those simple materials, he did wondrous things, from searching pencil lines that repeat and transform to layered washes of watercolor that explore translucency and luminosity. In making his drawings, in attempting to, as he would put it, make concrete his sensations, Cézanne looked closely, and that close looking became our method too. So our plan tonight is to continue that close looking with all of you. In that effort, I'm joined here by my colleague and co-curator, Samantha Friedman, and by artist Julie Mehretu. I'm sure so many of you who have joined us tonight know Julie's work, but as a reminder, Julie lives and works in New York City and Berlin. She was the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship in 2005 and the US Department of State Medal of Arts Award in 2015. She's shown her work widely and is represented in public and private collections across the world. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, she's represented by the Marion Goodman Gallery in New York and Paris. A mid-career survey of Julie's work is currently on view at the Whitney Museum of American Art through August 8th, and I can't encourage you enough to all go and see it. So wonderful to see you tonight, Julie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a super honor to be here and to be in conversation with you both on such a phenomenal show. Congratulations on the exhibition.
Thanks.
After, I think you said 3 years of work and research, right? Like
exactly, 3 years of thinking about Cézanne for a long time, but really working in a focused way for 3 years, which I'm sure you must have been working on your show for just as longer.
Yeah, longer it turns out. Well, and the pandemic contributed to that, thanks, but
yeah, same for us. So Samantha and I were so fortunate to see your extraordinary exhibition just as we were preparing to install Cézanne Drawing, and looking closely at the mark making in your work and feeling really enveloped in the layering, navigating tensions between opacity and transparency, and seeing your engagement with the political, all gave the two of us so much to think about as we continued our own journey to understand Cézanne's approach. So seeing your exhibition was for us a kind of rediscovery of the past through the present. So tonight, what we're hoping is that the three of us can continue to make those connections across time and kind of across town. And for the first part of this program, the three of us will be in conversation looking at your work and those by Cézanne, and then we'll turn to audience questions. So please send us those via the YouTube live chat section, and our producer, Sean, will pass them along to me.
Okay.
So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Samantha, and let's look at some drawings and paintings.
Thanks. So just looking at, a work of Cézanne's alongside a work of yours, Julie, some of the issues that strike us as central to both of your bodies of work include languages of mark making, issues of transparency and layering, questions of how to structure a composition, and tensions between narrative and abstraction. And so we thought we'd start by asking you a question that many of our viewers tuning in tonight have actually already sent over to us, including Lorinda Ash and Blair Brown. So thank you for those questions. And that is, what does Cézanne mean to you? Does he mean anything to you? What excites you or frustrates you about his work, and what lessons lie there for you?
I mean, I think Cézanne has constantly been this very, this touchstone of a particular way of thinking that surprised me when I was very young and moved me when I was very young, but then is continued to always be interesting and revealing, which is this way of trying to make sense of the world through looking really intensely, and then really trying to study how to deal with the idea of space, but within the space of flatness in a way. Like, so that's a very abstract way of trying to make sense of something, and Picasso pushed this as well. And I think that's always been something that's been formative for me, and a way of kind of thinking about painting and that type of space as being this kind of multivariant, this space of multitudes where these various things can occur in this very flat surface. And so that's always been super interesting to me. And but also the mark making of Cezanne is always what's also kind of stayed with me. Especially, I think the drawings are really, really interesting to see, because you learn this other way of study that he was thinking, that he seems to be using, that's very different from the way that he uses language in his painting in some ways. But then still in the painting, you have these moments where the brush marks actually suggest something outside of what's happening in terms of the planes that he's working with. But so he's always been important to me since I was young. What's interesting here about this juxtaposition is that this drawing is very small. I mean, it's less than 8 by 12 inches, right? It's a small drawing from what I remember. And this painting is 10 feet by 15 feet. So it's a really different scale. But it's when you put them next to each other, you have this compositional structure that it is very reminiscent of certain forms of history paintings that I know Cezanne was studying, as well as that I've studied and have been a part of how I've been thinking about these enormous works. And it's interesting to see this drawing that really has this particular sense of drama in the middle, and what happens on the edges, and the kind of structural way that it's put together by these marks that is really reminiscent of that form of this compositional structure that was used, or logic that was used in a lot of these history paintings.
Yeah, I mean, you said a lot there for us to think about. And I think maybe, your response for us in terms of the way we're thinking about some of these issues falls into two kind of bigger ideas. And maybe the first is about mark making.
Right.
And maybe we can look at that slide that's kind of like a close-up of Cezanne's vocabulary of mark making. And I think I know when we were thinking about this exhibition and looking closely at many of the drawings, and I think that's one of the things that's so great about bringing them together, is we can see how these marks repeat and play out in multiple works. But we were really thinking closely about, the way he uses hatching and cross hatching, for example, on the pencil drawing on the left, or these little loops of foliage that appear in the center, or on the right, how you see that rather than a kind of a single contour, you get this kind of multiple line, or this searching line. And I'm struck, if maybe we want to look at that, that close-up of that single early drawing of yours, Julie, I'm reminded of the way that you've discussed your marks as kind of characters, those kind of dots and dashes, or crosses, arrows, squiggles, and waves. And, I think you've said before that you think about those marks as kind of signifiers in a score. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way that you think about that grammar of mark making, or whether you think about it as a kind of a repertory of marks, and what those marks do for you.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's really interesting if you go back to the Cezanne marks to think about how there's I think one drawing that I recall in the show that's really trying to articulate volume, and it was a drawing that I feel like he did in school or in an academy. It was that very, very formal drawing. Can you remind me what it was called? And
yeah, it was an academic study that he would have done at school with a live model.
Yes.
And there was a real sense of the figure's body. It was a nude male standing up, and a real sense of the figure's body.
It's really very precise undulation of skin. And so it's not like Cezanne couldn't draw like that. Cezanne, like the same way that Picasso could paint, remember the story about his wife and painting. She was tired of these portraits or these paintings he was making. And so he painted that really kind of traditional kind of painting of her. And I think that what's interesting about this show is that Cezanne was drawing not drawing is thinking, really drawing as a way of studying and thinking and trying to understand the world, but also what he was looking at and how to build that in terms of, I really see them as almost spatial studies constantly, even though he doesn't really use mark making to articulate value in a way. It's really interesting. Even when he does try to articulate value, or it feels like the suggestion of value. If you really squint your eyes, you really see that these things are these kind of flat planes in space. And I think that, so a lot of his mark making to me is much more about the space of a brain trying to study something, and it's notational, it's searching, as you used that word, the searching, this kind of the repetitive mark around a body. It's almost about the kind of impossibility of stillness, even though he can make the most. That portrait, that other drawing really shows his capability and his skills, but there's this constant mining and searching. And it's not about the beautiful mark or the beautiful drawing. That these are not about what they end up being. They're really about these forms of study and this form of trying to think, trying to make sense of a certain way of thinking through the action of making. And I think for me,
I think you kind of see that here with these. Yeah. I just had asked to put these up because you see it. So you see the same figure, this person who's dipping his toe in the water, and you see that kind of repetition, and that search, and then the relation to another figure who's sort of twisting around. And I guess I was wondering, as I was looking at these, is whether, if and we very much feel like you that that line and that repeating line is a kind of search, whether you I don't know whether you see line in a similar way, or whether you think about line as a kind of search for form.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, but but if the form is a form, it's a very kind of diaphanous and almost ungraspable form. It's almost about formlessness in a way. It's about like for me, I think the marks really do this kind of action of like being like these agents in a way, or the marks actually take on this effort at existing in a really different space, and not necessarily as the articulation of a particular form constantly. And I think that does happen. You have what's interesting is the collection of a particular type of mark will suggest a certain type of field or a certain type of receding space, or as much as it can suggest riotous figures, right? Or something like that. And so the marks, I think, to me, operate in a different way. I mean, in this case, with these images you have up, the marks really do participate in the kind of evolution of an image that evolved, that comes to this, or an emergent image that comes to the fore. But at the same time, these marks aren't necessarily descriptive marks. And I think that the Cezanne's mark making is not necessarily trying to be descriptive, but it is mining how to represent space in a particular way. Or maybe not even mining how to represent space, because a lot of the lines around the figure are only trying to, are really mining or searching. To me, it feels like they're just this deep kind of repetitive study that through a trance of doing it repetitively or over and over, you will arrive at some kind of other way to see this that you're looking at and that you can't capture in just a flat perspective. And that's this thing about what we see, what we perceive in the world, how we understand what we see, and the truths we assume by that, and the knowledge that what you don't see just on the other side of that figure is as crucial to understanding that figure as not. And how does painting and drawing and art making participate in kind of inventing these other spaces that are possible to experience what we know about this form of knowledge of the world in a way, and lived experience. And I think that, I think it's a really interesting place to think about how the mark and how drawing as a primary activity really can be generative to that form of study and understanding.
Well, I love that idea about the thinking about the kind of bigger meanings of when you articulate something that's kind of outside of the main thing. Because that's something that we see a lot in Cezanne's work, where you see like so much attention to what's happening around a sculpture that he might be drawing at the Louvre, or in between like an arm and the chest, and all this, like so much attention to the kind of void. And so that idea that that's about a kind of sense of like of the knowledge of the world, and the kind of what we know and what we don't know, kind of being aware of that is, I don't know if we had really thought about that way, because we were so focused on kind of what the void, how he did the void, as opposed to kind of like the kind of meaning of what that might be. So that's a beautiful way to put it, I think.
And it's really interesting, I think, to think about that also in terms of those drawings, those kind of, what did you call that first room of drawings, those study pages, or?
Yeah, we can bring one of those up. And
what did you call them?
Study sheets.
Study sheets, where I thought those were really fascinating, because they're really the way an artist spends time thinking through something, and it feels like whatever is at hand, it can be, you go back through a sketchbook, or you go back over a drawing that you already have. And I don't know. I know Chris O'Feely spent a lot of time making drawings, watercolors, while on the phone. Like, he has a space where you work on the phone, and you can, and I find myself constantly in talks, listening to talks, or whenever I'm sitting at a meeting, constantly drawing on the sides of things. But this feels to me very much like that form of study, this constant kind of trying to figure something out. And it's so interesting how many times when you look through them, certain forms are repeated. In terms of how you articulate that, but it's the spaces in between these that I'm super interested in as well. They don't feel haphazard.
No, definitely not. I think there's often this way of talking about the study sheets as if they're like accidental, or these motifs are kind of only like seemingly unrelated. But I think maybe a more productive way of thinking about them is that there is almost like this graphic compulsion or something that's at the heart of it, where whether conscious or not, Cezanne is thinking through drawing and thinking about these forms. And you can see the way, the round shape of his head mirrors the round shape of the apple, or the kind of lean of the clock figure on the back of this sheet mirrors the lean of this little figure copied from a book of Spanish painting. And so, yeah, it does seem to be kind of like associative on some fundamental level for him.
Right.
Should we
and go ahead. Jodi, sorry.
I was just going to say, I was thinking about when we were in the galleries, and you, we looked a little bit at that Cupid that was a kind of related to this, and maybe we can look at that one too, because you seem very drawn to that. And again, it has that kind of multiplicity that, I think it went off, but the similar kind of multiplicity there that we saw in the study.
I think this drawing is incredible. And I think for me, it is that multiple, but it is that, I mean, he did so many from what you showed us, and from what you explained, that are not fully in the exhibition, that are not, I mean, there are others that aren't in the show, but he was studying this Cupid quite regularly, right? Like, and to me, what's amazing about this is the effort of like the shape that can happen, but really what's the kind of spilling out of in a way, the subconscious kind of aspect of the back of the brain, the back of the head, and all that is kind of standing up behind this drawing. To me, that's the most, like, it's such an intense drawing. It almost feels like there's this part of Francis Bacon in this or something. There's this like aspect of this other form that is kind of emerging out of this space, and yet you can almost see the back of a figure and the arm coming down, and that feels much more sculpted in a way, and the clear erasure of the Cupid's head, which also almost feels like a monkey's head in a weird way. Like, it has this really kind of, I don't know, it's what, to me, I didn't really feel like a lot of the drawings were as in and of themselves, these kind of, there were many that but they didn't feel like these kinds of things that were necessarily these kind of like these almost sublime experiences. But this drawing really felt that way to me, and that's, I think, intentional. I think that these are really meant to be investigative of something, or like I said, like, to me, that's how I experience them, and that's what's so interesting about the show and so instructive, is this effort to mine and remine and redraw and look at it from this side and from that side, and the kind of tentativeness of the mark, but also the kind of, confidence in that mark that repeats itself and that then moves, is in movement, is not stable in space. And that's something that I think is really interesting that comes out in the drawings that's really different to me than the paintings.
And in this, if we can just go back to that image just for a second, because I think that this was something that I think that you all put together, and I'm just wondering if there was some you were thinking about, I don't know what this comparison, but you were thinking about when you put this drawing of yours with the one by Cezanne.
Well, this is a small drawing, and it has its various forms of mark making, but I think these were these small group of drawings I made for Helen's room in Cambridge. It's part of the Kettle's Yard Art Museum there. And her room was really the space that she spent a lot of time in. And I made a group of very small drawings to go in this. And then downstairs in the museum was the exhibition. But I think for me, what was interesting about that room is she stayed there a lot by herself and retreated there a lot when they would entertain people at the house. And so the whole house is this museum and kept exactly how they curated it and lived in it. And we were able to hang a few of these in her room, but there's this almost very intimate space there. And I was really interested in just participating with that, but also like in intimate space and in this small kind of really beautiful room that one would retreat to. And there was a little patch door that she could talk to him through. I was really interested in kind of mining this other kind of aspect. And so in this one, there's this back and this ass. And I think that's also something that really struck me about the Cupid is certain drawings that Cezanne made are very sexual or sensual and feel really like you feel that in them. And I was just, that was something, it was kind of like an interesting pair just because of that. Like this was a back and ass, like Cupid's back and ass.
I think that's our cue to look at those pairs that I remember were another watercolor that really seemed to draw you in, the one that we see on the right here. And the things that we've been looking at so far are mostly like black and white of Cezanne, and this is like this moment where you get this resplendent color, but also this incredible, like really almost blatant corporeality, right?
Yeah, again, like and the watercolor here seems so fresh. I mean, these must not have been shown that often or felt that way, I think, but they're at least the one on the right feels really, really. I remember it being really vibrant, the watercolor, as if it was just painted. And again, I think what was really interesting was the strange kind of structure and logic of these drawings or watercolors. And then also the effort at trying to play with space, and then the aspect of them really feeling a body like and felt. But they also weirdly in some parts feel very flat. That's another thing that I'm super, super interested in with Cezanne, like what this kind of constant, like there are the highlights from the paper, the idea of that being the most like volumetric aspect of them, but when you really look at them and there's just almost an outline that gives you a sense of their volumetric thing. They're not descriptive in that way. They become the use of the color and the use of the marks really becomes this other, it's a different formal way to read them. And I think that to me becomes really interesting as this way of trying to make sense of the world and space and that logic. That's one of the big lessons in this work. And then how the mark of the brush participates in that construction. Like when his paintings, they're so refined in such a different way that these are really about just getting the information down and allowing the mark to be what it is in this other way.
And when we're talking about space here, I couldn't help but look at that knife that's on an angle.
Yes. And
then the pot handle on the one on the right, which is both kind of, feels like this aggressive, some kind of aggressive force as compared to the kind of bodily pairs, but they they both seem to be trying to kind of get at something about space or depth, but then you're right, then there's this kind of counter kind of the flatness that you're talking about. So it seems like he's wrestling with those tensions between.
It's like he's really trying to show the underside of that arm of the pot, right? What that's sitting there. But it's also like a guillotine, like knife. It like has this really, and the other thing, like, and you know, there's this, I don't know, the way that it's even set in the image as being at this angle that's like can just slice those balls off. I mean, there's like, it's pretty like, I mean, they're great drawings. They're great watercolors.
Yeah, and the kind of violence and force and sexuality all mixed up together is something that Cezanne was really kind of more explicitly dealing with early in his career. So in the, you know, these are at the end of his life, 1900, 1906, and then in the early part, you know, we get something like this. Where the subject is a murder, and you know, where that violence is much more apparent. Although in this case also there's this kind of violent act, but in this very lush landscape, which is actually is somewhat true to its place. So it's a recognizable landscape that Cezanne would have encountered, but with this kind of imaginative violent act in the middle.
And that also makes me think of Goya, and I think you mentioned when we were touring the show that he really looks at Goya, like those drawings that feel like rape drawings or sexually kind of aggressive like scenes. There are these that they're very different than, let's say, the Picasso 365 etchings or 362 or 362, whatever ones he did that he tried to do every day of the year, but he didn't make 365, he only made 362. But they're all of these kind of very sensual kind of drawings, a lot of them, and they feel very different than the Cezanne drawings that felt much more like Goya's capriccios, and this reminds me somewhat of that, without the kind of the sense of awe or the facial description that Goya was really. This is like this feels like a very different kind of scene that from what the kinds of images or spaces that Goya would play with. But it's that contradiction that I think is really interesting, and I think it's super interesting that this was something Cezanne paid attention to a lot when he was younger. You were talking about paying attention to like what was happening in the news, and could you talk a little bit more about that? Because that was super interesting to me, because I hadn't really, you know, the way he was thinking about form and space and representation and that in relation to current events.
Yeah, and this one in particular, this has been the subject of some new research by a really great art historian, Andre Dombrowski, who teaches at Penn, and he actually, you can see the date here says 1874 to 75, but Andre believes actually it was made a bit earlier, just in the context of the Paris Commune of 1871, and that was this kind of uprising in Paris, and there was a revolutionary progressive government that was based on the idea of a kind of working class radicalism that was established in 1871, and it lasted for 2 months, and then it was there was a siege in Paris, and then the commune was brutally put down by the army. And so Andre supposes that this actually would have been done in the context of that. And Cezanne had fled Paris both to avoid the commune and also to, he was a bit of a draft dodger as well. And so there's all these letters about, oh, he's going to be like, they're going to catch up with him. And so Andre believes he's responding to the violence happening at the Capitol, and also what he's reading about in the newspapers and magazines and the popular press. And to connect this to kind of the popular press, this work was actually done on the back of a fashion plate from a magazine that his mom was a subscriber to.
Wow.
So there's a kind of material connection to something outside in the world, although it's a very happy, it's like fashion, you know, ladies in beautiful dresses and umbrellas, but then this very dark thing on the other side. And that tension is something that Andre kind of talks about, and it's a very, very convincing argument, and about, how artists at that moment kind of faced their current events. And it would be great, actually, in that context, to hear about your own engagement with the political and the kind of what's happening in our world.
Yeah, and it's just, I think there's this constant, artists are always trying to figure out one thing, and I've heard this from writers as well, this aspect of trying to understand who you are and then make sense of that in the context that you're in. And that can be social, political, it can be and the social political is part of the aesthetic, and it's all kind of intertwined. To me, I think that's been a core part of my work, and the point of departure of a lot of the way that I approach painting and drawing. But it's like, for me, when I'm working on drawings, it's really about mining how to push the language of the mark making, and what can, and it usually happens at moments where I really need to. I don't draw on paper all the time. I mean, I draw all the time, but not on paper. And I think that although recently I feel like painting has become a pastime because I've been so busy doing other things, but I'm just saying that in jest. I mean, I think what I mean to say is, really, drawing becomes, and working on paper becomes, this place of investigating how to break through the mark making to arrive somewhere else. And that happens very differently in painting than when I'm working with a brush. And what I'm trying to deal with, because usually there is this kind of political, social context that's informing the painting, in a way that I think the drawing is much more about how that exists with the mark of the ink on the paper, and that in and of itself is this kind of social gesture. But I do think that I don't think that it's possible to look at any of these works without thinking of their kind of social time and the moment that they're being painted in, and even how they're trying to understand space. Like, I think that trying to make sense of something from different perspectives is pretty radical as a concept, as an abstract concept. And to understand that not just any individual, but any political, social context is multifaceted, is part of that place. And I think this was so crucial to not just Cezanne, but to those early modernists who really pushed that possibility in aesthetics.
Yeah, I think it's so easy to think today, an artist like yourself uses mediated images that are all around us. And of course, it was like a similarly interesting time for Cezanne in terms of technology and access to images. And I think because we always picture him kind of on plein air and working from the motif, we forget that he was using mediated images, that murder scene was likely drawn from a lurid tabloid. And, in the study sheet, he's copying a self-portrait after Goya from a book, which is itself like a reproduced image that he would have been working from. So it's not all kind of direct from the motif. And there is that sense of reproduction and mediation as he's working. But maybe since you talk about, we're teasing toward the idea of space, I wonder if it might be like a good moment to turn to some landscapes, which really get at that tension between flatness and depth, and maybe think about how that kind of flatness and depth works together in a pair like this, where on the left you can see a watercolor from our own collection, where you get that kind of flatness that we talk about when we often talk about Cezanne in that way, where he's asserting the sheet, and there's this field of marks that when you look at it in the right way, you understand to be like a thicket of foliage. But then on a watercolor like the one at right, you get this sense of deep space, and you get this sense of vortex, or this kind of vertiginous pull, and he's able to create depth in that way.
Yeah, I mean, these are really interesting because even the way that he creates that sense of space in the right, it's really about the kind of paper, the space of the paper that allows that to happen. The marks themselves are participate in that construction, but in terms of their shape, but they really it's almost that there's a few directional marks that give you that sense of space, those kind of receding marks that lead you into perspectival space somehow, and then the absence of the marks in the center. And then the piece on the right, I think you have a detail image of that as well, where you can really, or you started the presentation today with a very close detail image of that. And one of the things I love about that detail, and when you really look at this up close, is then at this point, Cezanne's interested in the mark and how the mark in its articulation from a different mark really articulates this image differently, or whatever, or creates knowledge and meaning in a very different way. And yes, you can understand that that's foliage or something else, but that difference of the kind of drawn mark with the blue watercolor, and then the kind of watercolor that becomes an actual object, like the leaf, like the green, like blob of green paint. That's they're materially really different in terms of how they're articulating something. And yet this is completely almost illegible as what it wants to be. It's really abstract, and both of them are actually. And that's something that I think is pretty amazing. And when you look at some of these watercolors you have there in the exhibition, you actually feel like they're actually shimmering in light. You can almost actually feel that in terms of the way the marks are repetitive next to one another. And I don't mean that in terms of the impressionist version of that, but really in terms of the way that a landscape shifts constantly, is constantly like in motion. These seem to have that dynamic to them, and I feel like his repetitive marks around the leaves and around the way is because these things are never still in how we experience them, and that's really part of how I think they come across. I mean, again, they're studies. They're not none of these are something like, very differently than I think. Even the graphite works are. I mean, they really feel to me like they're about this. How do you unfold this space, and can we see this in these different ways?
Yeah, and I think in especially the one on the right, that the kind of mark is this, it's a kind of a patch of color that he's laying down on the sheet, and each patch of color is allowed to dry. Yeah. Before the next one is put on. And so then you get this, it allows each one to maintain its integrity as a mark, as a patch of color. And so and then allows you to see through each one. And I think that's part of what gives it this kind of prismatic quality, and feeling like there's just kind of color and light everywhere. But there's kind of a sense of time there too, because he has to wait for each patch to dry. And so we've talked a lot, as we've been working on these, about the time that it, like how a work evolves over time and kind of takes shape over time. I don't know if you're in approaching your work, do you have that kind of like that sense of, I mean, so your work seems to be about time, certain works seem to be about time, but then I'm wondering about the time of the making also.
Yeah, for sure. And the time that it takes to make things do bring up different decisions. And you look back at something and you can always go back into a drawing or a watercolor. I think that probably that Cezanne worked on multiple watercolors at the same time, which is what most people who are really trying to work quickly with watercolor. These aren't slow. These aren't slow, deliberate model. They're not where you paint something and you really wait and then you paint it. You can feel the rapid motion of the brush and the kind of notational aspect of the brush. And I think that, and the marks. And so there must, if he was working on several at once, he could do that. And by the time you go back to one, it's probably dry. I think the time that it takes, I mean, for what I think happens in these drawings in a way that's very different again from painting is that rapid motion of articulating something is, again, you want to keep your head out of your way. And you can tell when a drawing feels much more self-consciously made than when one just occurs. And I think that's really interesting in terms of the drawings you both selected and curated into the exhibition. There are moments where you really feel the labor in the drawing, it really trying to mine something else. I think even the two drawings you just showed, the one that feels much more like this foliage, you can actually see where the dry brush goes into the wet mark on the wet paper. And I think the way that I tend to work, I mean, that reminds me a lot of the way my father-in-law works. He'll work on, 12, 15 watercolors at one time, where he'll like do the ground and then do these one things to all of them and then goes back into them. And there becomes this logic that's investigated in all of them in this very different way. Whereas I tend to like do something and then do it on, and then wait for it to dry a little bit, but then go back into it. And they have these kind of these manifestations that happen one after another. And I feel like it's in their seriality that I get somewhere, not necessarily in the layering of them. Although, yeah, that tends to happen more in the paintings than in the drawings, although it does happen sometimes. But even when I would work with a watercolor dries quite quickly, to be honest. And so there is this very different way of working with them. But I think they materialize really differently. Sorry to go on too long there, but.
And what about the idea of series? Because like Cezanne is often returning to similar subjects, and we try to really play that out in the exhibition. And what's your thinking about series and in your own practice?
Well, for me, I tend to think of the paintings more as participating in cycles of paintings. I don't necessarily, so like they become this body of work, and for some people, I think that's much more of a series. I think there's certain paintings that I've worked on, or certain bodies of work that become like the Invisible Sun paintings, that are clearly these takes on a similar material and similar scale, similar structure, similar logic. But I think that in general, it's really, I don't tend to work in that more in that sense of a series, in that same way. But I think when I have done that, and I just did that recently again for my Mary Goodman show with these black and white blurred images where I just worked with airbrush, they tend to become this other form of studying between these images. And I really feel like, and I do that a lot, I guess, with drawings. They become these series of drawings, and they become, like I said, one after another. In the repetition and in what's different between them is where the lesson occurs and where the knowledge is developed. And I think that's pretty common for artists. But for me, and I can only speak for myself, that I feel like the lesson that happens in that is when the head is actually out of the way of, and out of not aware of what it's actually trying to do. This is what I love so much about that Cupid drawing. It really feels like something else took over, and it wasn't just this kind of descriptive aspect of trying to get down what he was looking at, but it was several things, right? He was drawing several things, and they merge into this really subliminal kind of experience.
Yeah, that that layering, we really, there's a lot of that in the exhibition. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, we really fell in love with that kind of layering. So I'm getting the signal that we should turn to some of our audience questions.
It's really a phenomenal show. You should both be, it's really great, and I encourage everyone to see it. I learned a lot, and you will leave it thinking of Cezanne very differently than you could think of Cezanne before.
And you can do, and we just think it's like everybody should go see one and then go see the other, just like hop across and think about the two together.
Well, thank you. An honor.
So one question that's come in, a live question from Frank Korb, who asks about kind of direct inspiration in terms of, because we were talking a bit about history painting, and that's something that we had talked about in the space of the exhibition too, and whether there are certain pictures out there that you are, kind of directly from pictures from the past that you think about when you're making your own work, or in terms of like structure or marks.
Definitely. And all through the last 25 years, I've been thinking about that and studying painting. And there are times where a painting, I mean, I can think of 2 times, and these 2 paintings are up, so I'll speak about them. One is a painting that is the last painting in the show at the Whitney, and it's a painting that directly is related to The Raft of Medusa by Jericho. And really kind of not just, I was thinking about that painting because of its content and because of photographs I've seen that mimic that feel very reminiscent of that painting. But also the structure of that painting is super compelling, and the kind of the compositional way that you enter that this kind of horrific scene of cannibalism and death and this kind of desperate effort at trying to arrive to something else, and the horror that's embedded in that. And I think, to me, that painting became, this painting has a relationship to that painting, but it also it evolves into something else, but you can still see the corporeal kind of like structure of the back and the center, and almost the gesture of the African waving the flag, the French flag, and trying to call for help, and the father holding his son's corpse as it drags in the water behind the boat. All of this is somewhat suggested in this painting, even if it's just directionally, and the kind of compositional structure of it, even though the images and the source of what happens in this painting is very different. But there are quotations of even some of the corpse studies that Jericho did in making his painting. So that's one example. Another example would be there's a painting that just was hung at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this painting I made without a blurred photograph or without any kind of source images underneath. But as I finished the painting and got to an arrival in it, it really reminded me of the kind of conversion. I think it's the conversion of St. Paul on the way to, I think that's the name of the saint. Like, I hope I'm correct, but it's this Caravaggio painting that I've seen 30, 40 times it's right off Piazza del Popolo at the Chiesa Santa Maria, or I think that's what it is called. But it's right, and there's this amazing painting of St. Paul, limbs spread apart, with the kind of immense light emanating from his chest on the ground and off of the horse's ass in the back, and it kind of becomes the main gesture of the structure of that painting, becomes this aspect of light that you don't really see, but the compositional structure of that painting is really strong and very unusual. And I feel like when I saw that in this other painting I had made, it was an associative relation. So I titled the painting after that, for that associative dynamic, even though it's a very, very different kind of picture. I don't think that there's really a horse in the painting or any aspect of that kind of, but that sense of ecstasy that is suggested in the Caravaggio is what felt very apparent because of the gold paint in this painting that I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I think in a different way we see that in our exhibition. You really see Cézanne's admiration for Delacroix and following certain compositions, sometimes direct quotation, sometimes something that feels a little bit further afield, but he's an artist that really loomed large for Cézanne.
Yeah, Delacroix is amazing too. Yeah.
So another question is, so Cézanne obviously isn't here to see his work installed in our exhibition. And so there was a question that came in about the way you install your work. Are you interested in seeing a kind of arc that happens over time? Is that something in terms of kind of a chronological development? And you see that certainly in the first space in the Whitney where we see some of those earlier drawings.
Yeah, I mean, I think installing the survey is very much that you have these different approaches to it. In this case at the Whitney, I think there are moments where that narrative folds in on itself. You experience paintings that were made after other cycles of paintings, and you experience them earlier because of the way that we could pace the space. For example, the Mogamas that were all made in 2012 really exist in a space on their own. And then, for example, this room, which were paintings made from 2016 into 2018, and then even I think those prints, those etchings were made and finished in 2019. As were one of the paintings in this room. There's this so I guess 2016 to 2019, you have these kind of mixtures of work, and you move between the room just before this, where the last painting was completed in 2013. So there is this kind of jump between things. And part of that is because of the way that we could use different spaces in the galleries, and how there's a space with the horizontal kind of panoramic black and white paintings that are all more about these kind of public squares. And that room, which almost mimics a public square or plaza or stadium kind of collective space, that room, those paintings were really finished in 2013. So you have this gap in time between those, but the paintings that would be in between those are in the room right before that plaza. And somehow the logic works. So it's not necessarily that it needs to be chronological. And I think for me, the interesting lesson, or what was really instructive, is the certain kind of repeat patterns that keep happening in the work unintentionally. And in LACMA, you could see the most recent paintings. You could see the oldest paintings near them. And it was so interesting how very differently I work with color, but how color keeps repeating itself in particular ways that I don't think anyone could compare the last paintings to the early paintings and feel like they're reminiscent of one another. But there were actually, when you could see them, like you could in LACMA from in the closing of the show, you could see back into the beginning. You could see these relationships that were somewhat emergent informally in terms of how these were constructed. And that was super interesting to experience and to learn from. But I mean, it's rare to be installing a survey. So I think for the most time, it's you're installing or making paintings as a group and kind of thinking about their relation, them in relation to one another, and more about an installation of how that operates and what is said in that.
So I have something that's an interesting question from Mariam Sharp, who asks, who points out, and we don't have this in our exhibition, but that Cezanne did experiment with colored lithography. And so the question is, it would be great to understand how your work has been influenced by printmaking and the kind of new technologies that might be available to you as an artist.
Yeah, I mean, printmaking was something I fought hard against when I was first brought to it, and it became something that was so important to my work and so instructive. And I started the earliest drawings with etchings and an etching needle, and that's one of the reasons the mark became so reduced. And then it was through that investigation and continuing with printmaking and learning and working with incredible master printers who were basically like, for a musician, it's like working with an incredible producer, and each producer brings a different kind of sense to what they can make with you. And that's what it feels like to work with a master printer. They bring different forms of technology, different forms of working with this technique that's hundreds of years old. And in some cases, even the breakthroughs with aquatint, 300 years old or whatever, these things that they become there are all these different techniques that we have at our disposal now that we didn't then, photo techniques, but also with the computer and digital techniques and how we can use that, and light and material in terms of the materiality of the plates and what can be done. It's pretty amazing. And so each printer brings a different form of technology and knowledge of how to achieve something. And it's been super, not just instructive, but I think working on prints all through the times that I've been making paintings, and has really shifted a lot that happens in the work. And I can't imagine the kind of work would have evolved without working in prints.
Yeah, there's big immersive multi-panel ones are just incredible.
One other thing I should say, etching is a very slow thing, and printmaking, but it's also something that you can look at, like you can't do in painting. You can't look at all your layers at the same time. Like with print, you can really see each different layer and make, that's just like taking apart a bicycle into all its little parts and putting it back together. It's never going to be the same, but there's this different knowledge you have once you've put it back together of what happens in that. And that's kind of what happens when you take apart the mechanisms of making something into these parts and have to study them or achieve something. very differently. It's almost like working with your hands in a bag or something. Like, you're working backwards, you're working in layers that you don't understand. If you're working from darks to lights, sometimes that's even happening backwards. So it's really the brain having to negotiate this stuff very differently. And it's super interesting what becomes clear, or what one can learn from that process.
Amazing. Well, we're drawings and print curators, so we like that shout out to prints. So I have to move to our final question, and so we've been talking a lot about what Cezanne's art makes possible, and we've been thinking a lot about what his work makes possible for younger artists. And so we have to ask you if you have a sense of what you hope your work makes possible for the next generation. So are there things that you hope that younger artists or artists to be might take from your work?
I think there's a lot of we're living in a really complicated moment, like every moment. I mean, in the same way that many people have felt about moments before us, but with mediated images, and the experience of most art can be experienced through your phone and through this small device where you see something that's no more than 3 inches by 2 inches or something like that, and so the kind of image of a work is where we experience, and there's a lot of room and really interesting work being made in that digital space and in that mediated space. But at the same time, there's something about painting that is, and film, and there, you can think about this very easily when you think of film or video or time-based mediums, but there's something about painting and sculpture and material, but really that are time-based mediums in the same way. And they really take a lot of time to make them, and they take a lot of time to actually experience and understand them. And they're not the kind of thing you can understand when you look through an image quickly. They're one of the reasons I really go around and look at exhibitions as much as I can, so that you can actually understand the work in person, because it looks really different than it does on the screen. And I just hope that that what I'm interested in, and one of the reasons I think I keep painting and wanting to keep making paintings, is that kind of visceral experience, physical, transformative experience that can happen in front of the actual work of art, where it can elicit and shift who one is and how one experiences. And I have really strong memories of when that has happened to me in front of particular pieces I have never known of, and pieces I find that I should have known of. I remember a time in Sicily looking at this painting by an unknown painter. It was a what is it called when you're painted right on the wall? I just can't remember.
Like a fresco.
A fresco, thank you. It was a fresco that was taken from a palazzo that they didn't know, and it was reinstalled in the museum in Sicily, the National Museum there. And this painting is called The Triumph of Death, and it's an unknown, painter from around the 1400s, and it's incredibly moving and transformative. And I've never seen something like that, and experienced what I experienced in front of that work. And I think that experience, and what can happen in front of Rembrandt, what can happen in front of these different, Cezanne, and these are Whistler. These are things that have been transformative. And I think that I hope that form of interest and continues. And I think that it's still very, very possible and important in the aspect of painting and making objects.
That's a perfect way to end on the importance and what you can learn and get from looking at works of art. So
I think it's really important that they're not just they're really forms of knowledge building and world building, and that form of knowledge that can exist in that physical experience, even if it's an unquantifiable or unknown or unscientific kind of thing, it is super important and valued and important for our evolution, and crucial, I think.
Agree. Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of you out there for joining us this evening. If you weren't able to catch the whole show live, this video will be up on moment.org for viewing immediately after the stream ends. And we've had viewers tune in from all over the world. I have to give a few of these locations: Australia, Copenhagen, Costa Rica, Michigan, Montreal, Puerto Rico, Peru, Vancouver, Mexico City. So many more than that. So that's kind of amazing. And you can stay up to date with everything that's happening at the museum on magazine and at MoMA.org, where you'll find much more information about Cézanne Drawing on view through September 25th. And as a reminder, Julie's retrospective is on view at the Whitney through August 8th. So we really encourage you to visit. Thank you again, Julie. It's just such a pleasure to look at works of art with you and just learn so much. And again, we just love this idea of connecting across time. And I want to thank also our great AV team and Sean, our producer, and Kiko Abe, who is behind the scenes managing everything. So thanks again, and please come and visit both exhibitions.
Nice.